Bonjour à toutes et à tous, c'est Stéphane et Safran pour la chaîne Allié. Je vous remercie de me retrouver chez moi et donc chez vous. Aujourd'hui on est le 8 mars, c'est la journée internationale pour les droits des femmes dans le monde entier. Et aujourd'hui, Safran et moi, on n'a rien à vous dire.
On the 9th of October 2012, the Taliban shot me on the left side of my forehead. They shot my friends too. They thought that the bullet would silence us. But they failed. The extremists were and they are afraid of books and pens. The power of education frightens them. They are afraid of women. The power of the voice of women frightens them. Today, I'm focusing on women's rights and girls' education because they're suffering the most. There was a time when women social activists asked men to stand up for their rights, but this time we will do it by ourselves.
My recent research has shown me that feminism has become an unpopular word. Women are choosing not to identify as feminist. Apparently, I am among the ranks of women whose expressions are seen as too strong, too aggressive, isolating, and anti-men, unattractive even. Why has the word become such an uncomfortable one? I am from Britain, and I think it is right that I am paid the same as my male counterparts. I think it is right that I should be able to make decisions about my own body. If you believe in equality, you might be one of those inadvertent feminists that I spoke of earlier. And for this, I applaud you. We are struggling for a uniting word, but the good news is that we have a uniting movement. It is called He for She. I am inviting you to step forward, to be seen, and to ask yourself, if not me, who? If not now, when? Thank you very, very much.
My mother and I do not agree on many things regarding gender. There are certain things my mother believes a person should do for the simple reason that the said person is a woman, such as occasionally nod and smile, even when smiling is the last thing you want to do, such as strategically giving to certain arguments, especially when arguing with a non-female, such as get married and have children. Now, I can think of fairly good reasons for doing any of these, but because you are a woman is not one of them. And so, class of 2015, never ever accept because you are a woman as a reason for doing or not doing anything.
The first boy who held my hand told me boys don't want to hear about vaginas bleeding. Younger me could smell the misogyny. Vaginas only meant to be fucked, breasts only meant to be sucked, mouths only meant to blow. It's true, I know my waist meant to be compared to an hourglass. My voice only meant to quiver. Please, fast, yet I am silenced, for all we boil down to is sexual interaction. Not just me, my mother, sisters, friends all quicken their pace post 8:30 in the evening. So I wear my jeans long and wear my tops high, don't show my cleavage or a hint of my thighs. Don't want to be mistaken for wanting it. Because if I wear less, I'm more than just flaunting it, I'm risking it. Risking not my virginity, but my life. My hymen seems to be sacred, told to keep it till I'm a wife. If not, I'm a whore, a slut and skank and more, not as pure as I was before. At the age age of 12, my bra straps are sexualized. At the same time, we don't get damn sexual rights. My aunt raped by a husband, but marital rape is fine. Pucker up, it's a mad design. Get in line. So what I'm trying to say here tonight is, I'm sorry I was brought up in a family where my brother taught me wrong from right, where my mother believes in our generation to better the world and make it slightly easier for each and every girl.
Este es el siglo de los derechos de las mujeres. Más tarde o más temprano, las jóvenes que portan en sus mochilas los pañuelos verdes van a conquistar los derechos que reclaman. En sus dedos está el poder de votar por nuestros derechos. No les tiemble el pulso para hacerlo. Saquemos de la clandestinidad al aborto. Legislemos por la salud y por la autonomía de las mujeres. A las auroras, esta multipartidaria de mujeres que llegó para quedarse en la política argentina, unidas en nuestra diferencia, pero siempre a favor de las mujeres. A las mujeres en sus casas, a nuestras madres y a nuestras hijas. Que el aborto sea legal, seguro y gratuito. Que sea ley.
The Black Panthers still exist, and the Black Panthers are still extremely active in the Oakland community and in communities all over the country. I'm not sure whether you are aware of what is now happening in the Black Panther Party and the kinds of things that members of that party are doing now.
No, but tell me.
First of all, if you're going to talk about a revolutionary situation, you have to have people who are physically able to wage revolution, who are physically able to organize and physically able to do all that is done.
Yeah, but the question is more, how do you get there? Do you get there by confrontation, violence?
Oh, is that the question you were asking?
Yeah.
See, that's another thing. When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence, without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them. On the other hand, because of the way this society is organized, because of the violence that exists on the surface everywhere, you have to expect that there are going to be such explosions. You have to expect things like that as reactions. If you are a black person and live in the black community all your life and walk out on the street every day seeing white policemen surrounding you, when I was living in Los Angeles, for instance, long before the situation in LA ever occurred, I was constantly stopped. No, the police didn't know who I was, but I was a black woman and I had a natural, and they, I suppose, thought that I might be a, quote, militant. And when you live under a situation like that constantly, and then you ask me, you know, whether I approve of violence. I mean, that just doesn't make any sense at all. Whether I approve of guns. I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama. Some very, very good friends of mine were killed by bombs that were planted by racists. I remember from the time I was very small, I remember the sounds of bombs exploding across the street, our house shaking. I remember my father having to have guns at his disposal at all times because of the fact that at any moment we might expect to be attacked. The man who was at that time in complete control of the city government, his name was Bull Connor, would often get on the radio and make statements like, niggers have moved into a white neighborhood, we better expect some bloodshed tonight. And sure enough, there would be bloodshed. After the 4 young girls who lived, one of them lived next door to me. I was very good friends with the sister of another one. My sister was very good friends with all 3 of them. My mother taught one of them in her class. My mother, in fact, when the bombing occurred, one of the mothers of one of the young girls called my mother and said, can you take me down to the church to pick up Carol? We heard about the bombing and I don't have my car. And they went down, and what did they find? They found limbs and heads strewn all over the place. And then after that, in my neighborhood, all of the men organize themselves into an armed patrol. They had to take their guns and patrol our community every night because they did not want that to happen again. I mean, that's why when someone asks me about violence, I just find it incredible. What it means is that the person who's asking that question has absolutely no idea what black people have gone through, what black people have experienced in this country since the time the first black person was kidnapped from the shores of Africa.
And as I wrote in the preface to Caliban and the Witch, in fact, I began after beginning to, I was very interested in looking at the history of the women's oppression, what used to be called women's oppression, and seeing how it had changed in capitalism in response to many of the debates that were taking place in the women's movement as to whether the gender-based discrimination was a legacy of tradition, was a remnant of previous patriarchal relation, or it was a specific type of social reality specific to capitalism. So that's how I began this historical work that started with the 19th century and then, for lack of good answers, took me back to the Middle Ages. And then after a while, I began to collaborate with Leopoldo Fortunati as I wrote in the preface to Caliban and the Witch. We had an early version of this work, but actually quite different. In Italian, they came out in 1984, but where I began to sketch the discussion of the witch hunt and the discussion of the transformation of the body in capitalism. But we also discussed other issues, such as, for example, the transformation that child raising undergoes in the beginning of capitalist development. So this is a work that has accompanied me for decades. And by 2004, I had been with it almost 30 years.
There's a book that you published in '84 in Italy.
Mm-hmm.
What like how did you do the research? Was it with Fortunati and others?
Yeah, we actually worked quite separately because I was in New York and she was in Padova, so we actually did work in a separate way. Even though we kind of exchanged some basic informations, but so that work was supposed to basically concentrated on looking at different aspects of the reorganization of reproduction. For example, it has a chapter on the transformation of sociality, of forms of sociality. It has a chapter on precisely the redefinition of the figure of the child. It has a chapter specifically on the question of sexuality. But the framework of that book was somewhat different. In a way, it was before the beginning of globalization. And the idea there was, in a way, to show that the classic operaist, one of the ideas, but that not only the classic Marxist approach to primitive accumulation, but also the operaist approach to class struggle and to basically capitalist development were unsatisfactory. And one of the themes in the introduction was first comes society, in quote, meaning first comes the reproduction of labor power and then comes the factory, which turned the other way around. For example, the Trontian idea that the factory is the prime mover, and in a sense the factory then also changes society. And our argument was that when you look actually at the history of capitalism, you see that capitalism first had to form a certain type of laborer, and only in a later period, in a sense, creates, on the basis of the formation of that type of labor, also creates a certain type of organization of work. Mm-hmm. Particularly a large-scale industrial organization of industrial work.
Yeah. Before we come to the Caliban and the Witch book, after publishing the Italian version, or And before you, this is 20 years, right, before you published the book, Caliban and the Witch. How did that discussion continue? Did you collaborate with others apart from
No, actually the discussion pretty much continued. I continued the work pretty much by myself, but one major development that took place was the fact that by the early 80s, I went to Africa. I was in Africa for about 3 years. And that experience was fundamental because in Africa I saw really the beginning of globalization. I saw what were the first element of a return of primitive accumulation, through the imposition of structural adjustment and all the policies that were enacted in response to the debt crisis. So in a way, again, as I wrote in the introduction to Caliban and the Witch, I was continuously brought back to the period of primitive accumulation, but what was unfolding, under my eyes, including the fact that the discussion about the debt crisis, the conditionalities posed by the IMF, and the discussion of austerity came hand in hand with a whole ideological attack on women, which in many ways were accused of having caused the crisis with their excessive demand and with their pressure on the workers, the family member, etc., for better living conditions. So the striking similarity between the processes that I saw unfolding in the 80s in Nigeria and what I had been reading concerning the period of primitive accumulation was very important for my own rethinking and my own placing that discussion also in a broader framework.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about the book, like how, the book is divided in several chapters. Could you describe like the contents and the main argument?
Yeah, basically the book is made of a number of chapters. The first one, it's a chapter about the crisis of feudalism, and in particular is a chapter that looks at the reasons why capitalism developed, and which was fundamental in my view in order to understand what would be the modalities of the new structures and the new structures that capitalism had to implement. So I, in particular, was concerned with demystifying, rejecting the assumption that capitalism was a kind of evolution out of economic structures that had developed in the Middle Ages, and to show, in fact, that capitalism was a counter-revolution. The capitalism was the response to a whole set of social movements, a struggle. That was very important to me because it connected, it really gave me an insight, into the struggle that women had been making in the course of the struggle against feudal power. And therefore an insight as to why the attack, why capitalism, in a way, the development of capitalism had to start with this massive attack on women. This was for me one of the most exciting and satisfying researches, because it brought me in contact with the whole set of social movement that I knew vaguely of, like the heretic movement from my early studies of European history, but I had no idea how important those movements had been, because the heretic movement were really movement of social struggle. They were movement against basically feudal power, but also the beginning of commercialization and of social relations. And I began to see also the role of women within this heretic movement, which was very strong. Women had a central presence in those movements. So this was important because, first of all, allowed me to see two things in terms of understanding capitalism It allowed me to see, number one, that capitalism had come in response to a struggle, and in particular in response to the labor crisis, to the command of a labor, the crisis of command of a labor that this movement had produced. And therefore, not accidentally, capitalism was vitally interested in creating relations that would maximize the exploitation of labor. And second, that within this struggle, and that women have played an important role, and the refusal of certain relation with men, and also a particular relation to procreation, had been important, had played an important role in this struggle. For example, the heretic movement gave women a certain status of parity with men, and also one movement that was critical with respect to women's subordination, but also the exclusion of women from the position of some power, for example, in the organization and administration of sacraments and so forth. So that too was important because it opened the possibility of understanding why this specific attack on women.
I insist that what it is to be a woman, or indeed what it is to be a man or any other gender, is an open-ended question. We have a whole range of differences, biological in nature, so I don't deny them. But I don't think they determine who we are in some sort of final way. At the heart of these controversies is the distinction between sex and gender. But what is that distinction? How do we think about it? Sex is generally a category that is assigned to infants that has importance within medical and legal worlds. Gender is a mix of cultural norms, historical formations, family influence, psychic realities, desires and wishes, and we have a say in that. My early life was affected by the 1960s and the social movements that took shape during that time. I grew up on the east side of Cleveland, part of a Jewish community, and by the time I was in high school, I was politically active, but I was also taking university courses in philosophy. In my 20s, I came to see that it was not just the Jews who were apprehended and extinguished by the Nazi regime. It was queer people, it was gay, lesbian people, it was people with disabilities, people with illnesses, Polish workers, communists. And my sense was that one needed to widen the lens and see that many people have been subject to genocidal politics, and to understand that there are different forms of oppression. I remain convinced that one does need to know history in order to make sure it does not repeat, and that one wants justice not just for the group to which one belongs, but for any group that suffers in a similar way. In the 70s and 80s, I was part of a movement of people who were rethinking gender during that time. Queer theory was emerging. It was in a complicated conversation with feminism. Trans issues had not yet surfaced as part of our contemporary reality. So it was a moment in which we asked questions like, what has society made of us, and what can we make of ourselves? There were a number of versions of feminism that I tended to oppose. One of them held that, well, women are fundamentally mothers and that maternity is the essence of the feminine. And then a second one thought that feminism was about sexual difference, but the way they defined sexual difference was always presumptively heterosexual. And both of them struck me as wrong. I was pretty committed to the idea that people ought not to be discriminated against on the basis of what they do with their body, who they love or how they move or how they look. All I was saying is that the sex you're assigned at birth and the gender that you are taught to be should not determine how you live your life. Sometimes people point to gender trouble as the inception of gender theory, but people were working on gender before me, Gail Rubin and Juliet Mitchell and Simone de Beauvoir herself. Simone de Beauvoir was an existential philosopher and a feminist philosopher who wrote The Second Sex in the 1940s. The basic point was that one is not born a woman, but rather becomes one, that the body is not a fact. She opened up the possibility of a difference between the sex you're assigned and the sex you become. Gail Rubin was an anthropologist and remains an anthropologist who wrote an extremely influential article called The Traffic in Women. And what she tried to say was that the family was a structure whose task it was to reproduce gender. And one of the aims it had was to kind of keep heterosexuality looking really normal. And although it was part of feminist anthropology at the time, it allowed us to start thinking about gender as something that could be reproduced, crafted, cultivated, and that there were systems, frameworks to which gender belonged. There was one other dimension of Rubin's work, which was, interestingly, psychoanalysis. She basically said, well, maybe there's a whole lot of repression going into becoming a man and a whole lot of repression going into becoming a woman, and that one of the things we have to do is to conform with existing gender norms, is to rule out all those possibilities of being, feeling, doing, loving that don't line up with the gender norms that are governing our lives. So anthropology, psychoanalysis, they all had their place in that moment way before gender trouble emerged on the scene. I think at the time that I wrote Gender Trouble, people treated gender as if it was a natural fact or a sociological reality, but they didn't treat it as something that you could make and remake. Performance is important to the extent that we do enact who we are. And anybody in performance studies actually knows that there are performances that we do in our lives that are not mere performance, they're not fake. When performative was first coined as a word, the philosopher J.L. Austin was trying to understand legal utterances. So when a judge says, I declare you man and wife, you become man and wife once that declaration has happened. That's not fake. That happened. Now, what if we were to say that in enacting our lives as a particular gender, we are actually realizing that gender anew. We are making something real happen. When gay and lesbian people started coming out, or when trans people started living openly, something changed in the world. By appearing, speaking, acting in certain ways, reality changed. And it has changed. We are seeing the changing of terms. We no longer speak about family, woman, man, desire, sex in the same way. Even the Cambridge Dictionary acknowledges that something has changed. Okay, so when we talk about performative, we're talking about an act that makes something come into being or an act that has real consequences. We're talking about the changing of reality. Even among progressive and liberal people I know, there can sometimes be a real resistance to thinking about trans rights or lesbian and gay rights or even women's rights. They sometimes say that these are secondary issues, or it simply makes them uncomfortable. Why should I have to refer to someone as a he or a she or a they? And yet, at least in the US, we learned how to talk about Black people differently, or we talk about women differently. And sure, it was probably hard to learn how to use new language. Maybe we had to adjust our habits. But stumbling is part of learning, and making an error is part of learning, especially when we're learning something new. sometimes we can all be vitriolic, right? Certain statements will set me off and I will scream. But if I only were to do that, then I would never be having a conversation with anyone. I think we all want to be the moral center of our universe. Like, that's right, that's wrong. You're canceled, you're not. You're with me, you're against me. But we have to allow ourselves to be challenged and accept the invitation to revise our ways of thinking, because that's the only way of being open to people who are trying to make their claim, sometimes for the very first time, to be heard, to be known, to be acknowledged. Now, I'm less interested in defending a theory of gender. I'm much more concerned with finding creative and effective ways of countering the attack on gender. One problem is that many people who refuse to allow trans people to define themselves is that they feel that their own self-definition is destabilized. The idea that we can change reality, transform reality to be more open, inclusive, just, less violent. There's an instability in that that's very frightening to people who want to understand their genders as fixed. But is anybody's gender necessary and universal, or is it a complicated emergence that happens with each of us? Our deepest sense of self is also formed in time, and we can't always know in advance what that will be. Freedom is a struggle because there's so much in our world that's telling us not to be free with our bodies. And if we are seeking to love in a free way, to live and move in a free way, we actually have to struggle to claim that freedom. When we live in a democracy, we assume that we're living according to certain principles: equality, freedom, justice. And yet we're constantly learning what freedom is and what equality is and what justice can be. And those challenges, right, the anti-slavery movement, the suffrage movement, the movement for LGBTQIA+ rights, I mean, each of those struggles involve challenging people's existing ideas of who's equal, who has the right to be free, and how do we define justice. We are all the time struggling to achieve that goal. We need to reoccupy these notions and show that concerns with racial justice and gender equality and gender freedom are an integral part of any democratic struggle, especially if we want to rethink who the people are and what it means for them to live in freedom without fear.
People always say that the girls of this generation are so vain. Why can't you put your brains towards books instead of good looks? I used to blame girls too. Be more than a perfect body with a pretty hairdo. And then I stepped out into the world. I opened my eyes to the truth about being a girl. I heard guys say things like, dude, she was 10 times tighter than that girl you hit and quit Ray, or I want to pipe your sister someday, or her ass looks like a racetrack with those stretch marks, but at least it's big like Kim K's. I never grew up thinking of those things. Don't blame me, but when I thought about boys, I thought about dinner dates and soulmates, not fuckboys that look at you like shark bait. It breaks my heart for every girl growing up in this world. Instead of, how was your day messages, we get, you up, wanna come fuck? I am not an object. I have a voice and something to say. Do not assume that I belong in your bedroom. I belong in a conference room. And for anyone who thinks that this generation is so vain, it's because us girls are held under a microscope day to day. It's like beautiful doesn't even exist unless you can cross everything off the checklist. Big butt, big boobs, skinny waist, include small nose, plump lips, bony hips, hairless, careless, but still has an awareness. In all fairness, I want to be seen as beautiful too. I mean, I don't want to be demeaned. I mean, I am not the same girl I was at 15. I mean, I am stuck in between being a girl and a woman, growing up in a world that has taught me to look sexy, get a degree, maybe a little rhinoplasty, but never, never disagree with misogyny. A world that has not taught me that being a woman means living in fear that your basic health care will disappear, or that your paycheck might somehow be smaller than a man that does the same job, Or that your boss might tell you to stop giving him blowjob eyes. If you want a raise, you gotta compromise. Show me what lies above those thighs. Boy, please. The moment you misidentified everything was when you forgot that not even 100 years ago, I could not vote. Look at what happens when you try to demote the very bodies that give birth to you, please. We are used to it all and we are appalled, but you see, we don't know what it's like to be free. Equality is not just about calling someone out. Equality is accountability. That my brother knows that I am equal to him, so equality is education. From classrooms to courtrooms to conference rooms and computer screens, it is using tech for good, for Me Too, for movements. Equality is truth, is strong voices, is breaking through the silence that exists, because silence can't exist if it's not tolerated. It is all of you, changing the future, clearing the path for every woman and every man. It is raising the next generation to know that not only does their voice matter, but it will be heard. And that's why we got the power in our hands, because we will not sit back and nod and smile while certain people reconcile the rules to being fertile. Sorry, but it's my body, baby. I may be a young lady, but my dad always taught me to speak out and fight against injustice of every kind. So here I am speaking out for all my ladies in the house. We will not stop the fight until we hold our rights for women of every color, size, shape, sexual identity, and place in this world. And that is the truth about being a girl.
Vers 5 ans, je me suis fait abuser par un inconnu dans la cage d'escalier de mon immeuble. Juste après, tandis que ma mère appelait la police, il y avait à la télévision un film pour enfants avec une petite fille blonde qui disait de jolies choses et de sa bouche sortaient des diamants, et une petite fille brune qui disait des gros mots et de sa bouche sortaient des crapauds. Vers 6 ans, j'ai découvert à la télé Fifi Brin d'Acier, une petite fille avec des tresses en l'air et une force surnaturelle. J'ai beaucoup aimé Fifi Brin d'Acier. À 11 ans, je me suis fait abuser par mon oncle. À 12 ans, j'ai commencé un régime que je n'ai toujours pas terminé pour tenter d'éradiquer ces rondeurs et cette graisse qui semblait poser tant de problèmes de désir et de dégoût. Vers 13 ans, j'ai vu des films avec Marilyn Monroe et j'ai chanté devant le miroir, la bouche en chœur, comme elle, tous ses succès. Vers 16 ans, au cours de théâtre où j'étais inscrite, je me suis rendu compte que pour 10 rôles d'hommes, il y en avait 2 ou 3 de femmes, et qui offraient peu de possibilités d'identification, à savoir l'obligatoirement jeune et belle fille à marier, la soubrette, moins obligatoirement jeune et belle, la marâtre, qui pouvait à loisir être laide et vieille puisque périmée, impropre à la consommation. Plus tard, j'allais me rendre compte que durant ces études, beaucoup de bandes de garçons allaient se constituer et travailler ensemble, et très peu de bandes de filles. Vers 19 ans, je me suis rendu compte que je n'avais pratiquement lu que des livres écrits par des hommes et dont les héros principaux étaient des hommes. Vers 24 ans, j'ai revu des films avec Marilyn Monroe et je me suis rendu compte que j'avais voulu ressembler à une idiote. Vers 25 ans, une casting m'a dit qu'il recherchait pour un film d'auteur une actrice prête à se faire sodomiser en vrai. Vers 26 ans, j'ai commencé avec Jean-Pierre Bacry à m'écrire mes propres rôles. Vers 27 ans, j'ai vu et aimé Thelma et Louise, mais après je me suis violemment disputée avec un grand ami qui reprochait au film l'usage des armes et la violence de ses héroïnes. Vers 30 ans, quand je faisais des interviews à l'étranger, j'étais très fière de clamer qu'en France, nous étions 20% de femmes réalisatrices, bien plus que dans n'importe quel autre pays du monde. Vers 34 ans, je me suis rendu compte que cela signifiait, je suis un peu mauvaise en calcul, que 80% de films étaient réalisés par des hommes, et je me suis demandé pourquoi j'avais été si fière d'un pourcentage aussi nul. Quelle puissante acceptation de mon infériorité m'avait fait me réjouir d'un chiffre aussi minable. Vers 35 ans, j'ai cherché une actrice jeune, en surpoids, pour un film, et je me suis rendu compte qu'il y avait très peu de candidates. Comme si elle s'était auto-censurée et interdite d'elle-même de pousser la porte d'un cours de théâtre. Un an plus tard, le film est sorti avec l'excellente Marie-Lou Berry dans le rôle. Et je me suis rendu compte qu'aucun magazine féminin ne la mettrait en couverture, comme ils aiment pourtant le faire lorsqu'une fille d'actrice célèbre accède à son premier rôle. Au mois de mai, à force d'hésiter entre 12 robes, j'ai eu envie de monter les marches du Festival de Cannes toute nue. Vers 35 ans, je me suis rendu compte que l'une des raisons pour lesquelles je trouvais les actrices de la série Soprano si épatantes était qu'elles avaient des corps normaux. Parce qu'autrement, dans tous les commissariats de police et les cabinets d'avocats, on recrute visiblement dans des agences de mannequins. Je me suis rendu compte que mes amies actrices travaillaient moins que mes amis acteurs. Vers 45 ans, je me suis rendu compte qu'il existait beaucoup plus d'écrivaines, de compositrices, de réalisatrices, de peintresses que je ne le croyais, mais qu'elles avaient été mystérieusement effacées de notre patrimoine. Je me suis rendu compte à ce moment-là aussi qu'on disait patrimoine et non matrimoine. En mars dernier, confinée avec un grand ami, je lui ai dit que j'étais un peu lasse des films d'hommes avec que des hommes. Lui ne voyait pas le problème, mais j'ai insisté et nous avons fini par voir Olivia de Jacqueline Audry, où il n'y a que des femmes. Mon grand ami s'est endormi au bout de 5 minutes. En octobre, une émission sur France Culture racontait l'histoire de Jacqueline Audry. Cette émission était intitulée « La disparue du cinéma français » et montrait comment la nouvelle vague, entre autres, avait méprisé et banni cette réalisatrice jusqu'à nos mémoires, jusqu'à l'effacer de nos mémoires, et tant moqué le fait qu'elle tournait en pantalon. En 2017, on a représenté pour la première fois correctement le clitoris dans les manuels scolaires. Depuis quelques années, on s'est rendu compte qu'une seule femme avait obtenu le César de la meilleure réalisatrice. En 2020, on s'est rendu compte que la composition des votants au César comptait une majorité de 65% d'hommes. En 2020, 88% des films à la télévision française sont réalisés par des hommes. Au cinéma, ce sont 76% des films, selon les années, un peu plus, un peu moins, qui sont réalisés par des hommes. J'ai 56 ans et je ne me réjouis pas de ces chiffres. Je crois à l'influence immense des images, et d'autant plus quand nous n'en avons pas forcément conscience. Je crois qu'une série télé avec un président noir peut aider à élire Barack Obama. Je crois que des représentations répétées de femmes filiformes, jeunes, blanches et soumises n'aident pas à l'épanouissement des femmes ni des hommes. Enfin, je me permettrai de m'inspirer de Camus qui disait que mal nommer les choses, c'était rajouter au malheur du monde, en disant que ne pas mettre en image nos diversités, c'est rajouter au malheur du monde. Je finirai par cette citation. Je ne sais pas qui l'a écrite, ça doit être une femme. Les filles obéissantes vont au ciel, les autres vont où elles veulent.
I turned 12 on the set of my first film, The Professional, in which I played a young girl who befriends a hitman and hopes to avenge the murder of her family. The character is simultaneously discovering and developing her womanhood, her voice, and her desire. At that moment in my life, I too was discovering my own womanhood, my own desire, and my own voice. I was so excited at 13 when the film was released and my work and my art would have a human response. I excitedly opened my first fan mail to read a rape fantasy that a man had written me. A countdown was started on my local radio show to my 18th birthday, euphemistically the date that I would be legal to sleep with. Movie reviewers talked about my budding breasts in reviews. I understood very quickly, even as a 13-year-old, that if I were to express myself sexually, I would feel unsafe, and that men would feel entitled to discuss and objectify my body to my great discomfort. So I quickly adjusted my behavior. I rejected any role that even had a kissing scene and talked about that choice deliberately in interviews. I emphasized how bookish I was and how serious I was, and I cultivated an elegant way of dressing. I built a reputation for basically being prudish, conservative, nerdy, serious, in an attempt to feel that my body was safe and that my voice would be listened to. At 13 years old, the message from our culture was clear to me. I felt the need to cover my body and to inhibit my expression and my work in order to send my own message to the world that I'm someone worthy of safety and respect. The response to my expression, from small comments about my body to more threatening, deliberate statements, served to control my behavior through an environment of sexual terrorism. A world in which I could wear whatever I want, say whatever I want, and express my desire however I want without fearing for my physical safety or reputation, that would be the world in which female desire and sexuality could have its greatest expression and fulfillment. That world we want to build is the opposite of puritanical. So I'd like to propose one way to continue moving this revolution forward. Let's declare loud and clear, this is what I want. This is what I need. This is what I desire. This is how you can help me achieve pleasure. Let's make a revolution of desire.
Dans les années 70, se dire féministe, c'est tout de suite, mais vous n'aimez pas les hommes. Alors qu'aujourd'hui, même de l'extrême droite, des femmes d'extrême droite peuvent se dire féministes. Le décolonial, c'est de voir comment la société demeure structurellement raciste, structurellement sexiste, puisque les deux vont très souvent ensemble. La notion de décolonial émerge il y a à peu près 10-15 ans en Amérique du Sud. Et ça rencontre aussi ce qui existait aux États-Unis dans le féminisme noir.
Les luttes sont toujours des luttes simultanées. Beaucoup de stratégies pour la libération de la femme proviennent directement de la lutte pour la libération des Noirs.
Les Noirs aux États-Unis disaient mais il n'y a pas que la domination masculine qui explique notre situation. C'est aussi le fait d'être femme, d'être noire, d'être descendante d'esclaves et d'être en prise avec le capitalisme américain. C'est pas simplement nos pères et nos frères qui nous oppriment. Je parle de féminisme civilisationnel parce que je trouve que ce féminisme a repris le vocabulaire de la mission civilisatrice coloniale. La France est supérieure à tous ces autres peuples parce que ces peuples ne sauraient pas finalement ce que c'est que les droits, ne sauraient pas ce que c'est que le progrès, le racisme anti-noir, l'islamophobie sont des formes de colonialité. Et le voile serait le symbole même de la soumission aux pères et aux frères. C'est-à-dire de ne rien comprendre à cette question du voile, de ne pas voir que des femmes musulmanes elles-mêmes luttent à la fois contre le patriarcat dans leur communauté, mais aussi ne confondent pas cette domination avec aussi d'autres formes d'oppression. Les inégalités nord-sud, ou le racisme quand elles sont en France, ou les politiques néolibérales. Je ne veux pas dire qu'il n'y a pas de tyrans dans ces communautés, ce n'est pas ça la question. Un féminisme décolonial prend en compte tous les niveaux et tous les éléments d'une oppression. Mais ça ne veut pas dire qu'on va excuser la violence d'un homme parce qu'il serait racisé. On va écouter la manière dont des femmes racisées élaborent et développent leur lutte, elles. C'est quand même les premières concernées. Il faut que la manière de raconter les luttes féministes change. On ne peut plus continuer à parler de l'âme de gauche au XVIIIe siècle si on ne parle pas aussi, dans le même temps, des femmes qui, dans ce qu'on appelait Saint-Domingue et qui deviendra Haïti, se joignent aux insurrections, prennent la tête, deviennent des soldats, vont être torturées, assassinées par les armées napoléoniennes. C'est de repenser le récit aujourd'hui en 2019 pour que des petites filles ou des jeunes femmes aujourd'hui élargissent le champ et non pas dans ce champ étroit de ce féminisme qui dit il n'y a qu'une seule manière de voir les luttes des femmes, c'est celle qu'ont menée les femmes françaises blanches. C'est impossible, c'est anti-scientifique.
I feel what I've learned through this whole experience is that, you know, women, we're nurturers. That's what's expected of us. We have our children, we have our husbands if we're lucky enough, and our partners, whoever. But we have to find personal fulfillment. We have to follow our dreams. We have to say, I can do that, and I should be allowed to do that.
And the rapist is you! It's the cops! It's the judges! It's the system! El Estado opresor es un macho violador! El Estado opresor es un macho violador! El violador eras tú! El patriarcado es un juez que nos juzga por nacer. Y nuestro castigo los
Hay una frase que a mí me encanta de esa canción de Un violador en tu camino, que es: el Estado opresor es el macho violador. Y esa es una frase que para mí es muy importante porque es una frase que señala que esto es un problema estructural, que no es solamente acciones de unos individuos, sino que tiene que ver con la forma en que está construido y pensado el Estado. Esas violencias no las podrían ejercer si no hubiera tamaña impunidad, si no fuera socialmente aceptado que tuvieran que disciplinarnos. Hay toda una serie de estructuras que tienen que ver con la educación, que tienen que ver con el Estado, que tienen que ver con una policía que no nos cuida sino que nos violenta, con unos jueces que son machistas y que no nos creen cuando denunciamos la violencia, que hacen que el mismo Estado sea el perpetrador último de la violencia. Cuando pensamos que es un hombre que por su maldad nos agredió, individualizamos el problema y no entendemos que aquí hay una responsabilidad estatal y una responsabilidad de los gobiernos que es mucho más importante que el castigo a esos individuos, porque detrás de cada agresor hay otro agresor y otro agresor y otro agresor, y es una cadena infinita de agresores que no se va a frenar hasta que cambien unas cosas estructurales en la cultura, en la educación, en la manera en que está planteado el gobierno, pero sobre todo en la distribución del poder. Latinoamérica tiene unas condiciones particulares que son muy especiales y que han sido cuna para unos feminismos de vanguardia que a nivel mundial hoy son muy interesantes. Nosotros somos unos países con una violencia muy fuerte, con una desigualdad muy fuerte y que tenemos un pasado colonial que ha dejado unas brechas muy hondas en nuestra sociedad que se muestran en esa desigualdad y en esa violencia. A pesar de estas cosas que de pronto son tan terribles, yo creo que esas desigualdades han impulsado un pensamiento feminista latinoamericano que es muy característico, que ha empezado a problematizar la violencia y ha empezado a buscar soluciones para esa violencia. En Latinoamérica hace 10 años estamos hablando de lo que significan los feminicidios y qué significa que te maten por ser una mujer. Sin duda, siendo países tan violentos, a los hombres los matan más que a las mujeres, pero los matan en condiciones distintas. Los matan en la calle, los matan cuando participan en pandillas, en grupos de narcotráfico, pero a las mujeres nos matan en la casa y nos matan nuestras parejas sentimentales, nuestros padres, nuestros hermanos, las personas que están cerca. Y también hay una forma de feminicidio que es una violencia expresiva, que es un mensaje a toda la sociedad, a veces perpetrados por esas mismas bandas criminales. Y esto nos habla de una violencia hacia nuestros cuerpos, que es una forma de regularnos y aleccionarnos para decirnos cómo nos tenemos que comportar, y que tiene que ver con esa rebeldía y con esas protestas que las mujeres hemos estado haciendo en los últimos 10 años. Yo creo que esa problematización de lo que significa el feminicidio en Latinoamérica es clave, porque no es lo mismo un homicidio, no es lo mismo que te maten porque estás haciendo una actividad de alto riesgo o porque estás en la calle o porque te van a robar. Es muy difícil y cruel que tu factor de riesgo para una muerte violenta sea tener una pareja, por ejemplo. Si tuviéramos igual cantidad de poder que los hombres, resistirse al acoso y resistirse a estas violencias sería más fácil. Cuando a ti te acosa un tipo que tiene igual de poder que tú le dices, quítate, pendejo. Pero el problema son todas las veces en que no podemos decir, quítate, porque sabemos que va a haber un castigo que puede ser emocional, que puede ser físico, que puede ser laboral, que puede ser social. Todas esas veces en las que no podemos poner esos límites son expresiones de esa desigualdad de poder en el Estado, en la cultura, en la sociedad. Y ese es el problema que tenemos que combatir.